Welcome to St. Croix Church, and we're continuing on in social isolation, and I'm continuing on in the study of James, and I'll have a Zoom call on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. If anybody's interested in discussing these ideas, please do call. Please do let Mary Ellen or me know, and we'll send you an invitation to the Zoom call. Tonight, looking at the second half of chapter 2, James 2, 14 to 26, and I would call it a grounded community. There's a big point in tonight's passage, and that point has to do with the weaving together of something called faith and something called works. And I think that it's an important corrective to the last time, or the last part of James that we looked at. So that was 2 weeks ago, and in between, Walter gave a talk last week. But this one, 2 weeks ago, I was talking about the community ethic, or the ethic of the new community, and it had a lot to do with making divisions and face value judgments about people, rich and poor, or for any reason whatsoever, and how bad that is, how wrong that is. The new community is not meant to be done this way, and so there's we're not to make face value judgments. We're not to show favoritism. We're not to think that some people are better than others. God doesn't behave that way, and neither should we. So last time I also talked about two economies, sort of a way that's natural to humans and a way that's above that. James talks about it as a royal law in the first part of chapter 2. The one law, love your neighbor as yourself, is greater than all the other human laws that people have, the human ways to divide people. And so the implication in last week's talk was that there's a spiritual way to live. There's something better than normal. There's something better than normal human. You can live in the sweat of your brow economy, or you can live in the realm of generosity and flow. As you are generous, God will also be generous with you. You can live in the realm of justice with people, where you demand justice when you're hurt, or you can live in a realm of forgiveness, where you hopefully receive it and you give it. The same thing happens with mercy and with judgment, as in the first part of chapter 2 that we talked about last week. You can look at everyone and make your judgments and think, oh, these people are better than others. Or you can live in a world where everyone needs and receives mercy, and everyone lives under the royal law of love your neighbor as yourself. So last week the focus was on a spiritual community, on the reality of the Spirit calling people to a higher ethic. But this week, I think that there's an important corrective. And the corrective it's to ground everybody in real life, to show that there is a spiritual possibility. There is a way to let God infuse your community. There is a way for all of this to be on a higher plane for humans. And yet that higher plane doesn't divorce it from ordinary life. It comes and fills ordinary life. So that's what I think this passage is about. And I'll read it in the NRSV. You can stop here if you want, go read it in your own Bible and take your own notes, and then come back. I think that would be profitable, but here, I'll read it now. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you don't have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, eat your fill, and yet you don't supply their bodily needs, what's the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. You believe that God is one? You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out? by another road. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. So it's an interesting passage. I'm just going to make a few grammar comments. I read the passage in Greek, and I thought my way through it, and quite a few things stood out, and I think far too many to talk about. But here are a few comments. Early on, it says, "What if somebody comes into your meeting and they lack daily food?" And the way to say that in Greek is ephemerae trophe, and we get ephemerae leads to our word ephemeral, which we usually mean fleeting. Ephemeral seems to mean fleeting, but it just means of a day or upon a day in ancient Greek, and it came to be used in ancient medicine. This is a sickness that will last for a day. It's ephemerae, or this is a medicine that will last for a day. Ephemerae, and then interesting, and this one I haven't followed through enough with, but the word for food, if somebody lacks daily food, the word is trophy, and it's very closely related to an ancient word that was used for a memorial for soldiers who had fought valiantly in battle or something like that. And it's easy to see how that idea connects with our idea of a trophy, some kind of an award or reward. But in this case, ephemerae trophe is being translated daily food or daily necessities. And I think for some people, the thing it makes me think of is that for some people, just to obtain what they need for each day is almost like winning a trophy at some large competition or some world-class thing. It's like it takes that kind of effort, that kind of ingenuity just to stay alive. That's what that idea made me think of. The writer, James, really lets people have it who think that they can get by living in some kind of airy-fairy abstract faith and not caring for other people's practical needs. He says, "Listen, you senseless person." And the word that he uses for senseless is kene, and it's the same word we get kenotic from in the Philippians 2 passage, very famous passage by St. Paul. And what it means is empty or waste. And so it's almost like you waste of a person, or you empty person, you hollow person. How hollow for you to be involved in a spiritual world that doesn't see the real needs all around you. The third thing is, James says, don't you realize that faith without works is barren? And the word arge, it's actually an agricultural word. And what it means is idle or lazy. It's talking about workers who just don't effectively do their job. And so faith that somebody has some kind of highfalutin faith that's focused on ideas or beliefs or prayers only is it's idle. And I like the idea. It's lazy. It just doesn't do the work that it's called to do. It's like trying to fly with one wing. It's only part of the task. And then there is a word that says that faith, if our faith and our works are brought together, then they are perfected, it says in some versions. In the NRSV, it said completed, and I think that's better. But I think better still would be to say have reached their goal. If you have faith and you are working it out in practical ways, then that is a faith and works combination that is reaching its goal. It's becoming what it ought to be. Then I want to just talk about the idea in here about Genesis and Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. I'll read this again. It says, was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. I guess that's the word I was just talking about. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Okay, I find this to be a confusing passage. There's a bit too much weirdness here for me. But anyway, I'll share a few ideas about it. The reason that I think it's weird is because The line that's quoted is from Genesis 15:6. It's quoted 3 times in the New Testament, twice by St. Paul and once here. And they both give different meanings to it. I'll say something about that in a minute. But if you look at Genesis 15, it makes no connection with Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac, which happens in Genesis 22. It's not about that. Abraham's just been on a rescue mission. He's rescued Lot and some of the people from Sodom. He's refused a reward from the king of Sodom. And he's still, he's tired after all of this. He's a bit depressed. And he has an encounter with God. And he reminds God that God hasn't fulfilled his bargain with him. And here's what it says in Genesis 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Don't be afraid, Abraham. I'm your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abraham said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, a servant. And Abraham said, You've given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside, said, Look toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. And then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. That's where the famous verse comes from that gets used 3 times in the New Testament. And it has nothing to do with Isaac. It has nothing to do with anything that happens later. It's simply that Abraham, in his depression, has an encounter with God, and God speaks into his heart and promises, once again, against all odds, that this older man with an older wife, that they're going to have their own son and their own descendants will flow. But his heart comes to peace with some kind of believing, and it's registered to him, reckoned to him, calculated to him. It's registered as righteousness. So St. Paul makes a big deal of this and says that therefore works are not important, but only faith. But James here gives the same idea, throws in the Isaac connection, sacrifice of Isaac later. I don't know what he's thinking about. And then says that it has to do with works and not faith. So just to say something about this, someone taught me this years and years ago, and I think they're right. James and Paul are 2 different authors, and they use the words differently. They have different meanings. Faith for James really is mere intellectual assent. He's already said in this very passage that the demons have faith, or they believe. It's the same word in Greek, pistis. So the demons believe, and they shudder. They believe that God is one. So they've got a level of faith. But that's not what faith is for Paul. Faith is like a commitment into a new atmosphere. It's like a bird in the sky or a fish in water. Faith is like stepping into a whole new way of life for St. Paul. Faith means something different for him than it does for James. Same thing with works. Works for James is it's something that you would do that would complete your faith, be the outworking of your faith. It's a very good thing. It's a positive notion. For Paul, works is a very negative thing. It's something that you would do to prove your worth before God. So if we just understand that these guys are using these terms, the same words in Greek, but have different meanings for them, then it actually makes sense. And most people, when they read Paul and James, know in their gut that they're both trying to say the same thing. But this can help to explain, I think, why it comes out so differently. Okay, if you want to check Paul's usage, it's Romans chapter 4 and Galatians chapter 3. Quotes the exact same line from Genesis and then gives the exact opposite meaning, at least at face value, from James. But underneath it all, I think they're trying to say the same thing. I have a question about the Rahab part. It says, in our passage, it says, Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? I see that just about every version that I looked at, and there's quite a few, translated it this way. But we don't really know when we're looking at these ancient passages whether there's questions or not, whether they're questions or assertions. We don't know because there was no grammar and no punctuation marks in the early text. So people guess and think this is a question. To me, it would read more easily if we were to say something like this. You see, Abraham talks about Abraham. You see, a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Likewise, Rahab, the prostitute, was not justified by works when she played her role in the story in Genesis in taking care of the spies. Or I guess it's later in the story. And so it's almost like saying, works, faith by itself isn't good enough. Works by themselves aren't good enough. That's actually what I got when I read it. It seemed to me to be saying that. But either way, you can see that the author is just crying out for some kind of a handshake between the part of us that believes and the part of us that acts. So just to bring all of this to a conclusion, I'll say this. It's the weaving together of faith and action that this writer is after. In the first part of the chapter, he sets the table for us to understand that there's a higher way. There's a way of the Spirit. There's life in the Spirit. But it's essential to realize, and that's what this second part of the chapter says, that this life of the Spirit doesn't remove us from real life. It infuses real life. And the Spirit is not more important than the body. Real faith is embodied and it's ordinary. It's involved in our ordinary lives. It cares for real needs. It cares in practical ways. Belief and the desire to live in the way of the Spirit propel us into the real world, not away from it. Last time we learned that we're not to treat people with face value judgments. We're not to have favorites. This time, I think that we see that although it's true that none of us is any better than anybody else, that we shouldn't have favorites or make face value judgments. On the other hand, each one of us can become better. Each one of us can become better than we were. Our faith can be completed. It can reach its goal as we combine real belief in a God who loves us with very grounded practical care of those around us. We can all be transformed by love, by a faith that's working itself out in real and practical ways in our ordinary world. I think it's a pretty exciting community that they want to build. Everybody belongs, and God is real, and we don't judge others, but we can grow and we can be transformed. So I think that's all for this week. Those are my ideas. If you want to talk about it on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock, see you there.